Safe smoking skid may contain alcohol swabs, lip balm, other materials to promote hygiene and reduce the transmission of diseases like HIV and hepatitis. I would note that what we're really talking about here is steps that we're taking as a federal government to address the opioid epidemic, which is killing tens of thousands, if not more, Americans every single day, week, month of the year. We put out this statement, though, because there was inaccurate information out there, or I should say HHS put out this statement because there was inaccurate information out there, and we wanted to provide clarification on the allowable uses for the HHS harm reduction program.
Just for a final point on it, does the administration support any effort then to distribute drug paraphernalia, like the pipes that we were hearing about?
The statement makes clear that we don't support federal funding, indirect or direct, for pipes.
Hi, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. I'm Jason Johnson, in for Nicole Wallace. Press Secretary Jen Psaki having to correct the record yesterday, clarifying that no, the White House is not funding the dissemination of crack pipes. It's part of a new federal grant program aimed at combating the opioid epidemic. The Washington Post provides some context. Quote, a heightened concern came months after the Department of Health and Human Services announced a federal grant for local programs that provide myriad harm reduction tools or services that minimize the risks associated with drug use, including distributing drug paraphernalia such as clean needles. Republicans seized on crack pipes, causing the phrase to trend on Twitter on Tuesday. The latest in continued resistance from the GOP against harm reduction techniques at a time when people are dying of drug overdoses at record rates in the United States. But look, let's back it up even more, right? This story started when conservative news outlet, and I use that term loosely, the Washington Free Beacon, published a story that stated the government was funding kits that will, quote, will provide pipes for users to smoke crack cocaine, crystal methamphetamine, and any illicit substance. The story was then written up in other outlets like Fox News and Black Enterprise and the Black News Channel. It was all over Fox News' television programming. And even Republican lawmakers spread the inaccurate information. Yesterday, the HHS released a statement denying that pipes are what the money is being used for. The statement reads in part, no federal funding will be used directly or through subsequent reimbursement of grantees to put pipes in safe smoking kits. The goal of harm reduction is to save lives. The administration having to address this story as it battles a wave of harmful misinformation and conspiracies recently, ones that hit on topics from COVID to the 2020 election and now drug prevention program funding. We know from the DHS's updated National Terrorism Bulletin that our current heightened threat environment is due to factors including an online environment filled with false or misleading narratives and conspiracy theories. So while this crack pipe misinformation can hurt Biden politically, false stories like it pose huge national security implications as well. And that's where we begin. Dr. Nyambi Carter is here. She's an associate professor of political science at Howard University. Also with us, Tara Sepmeyer, former GOP communications director and now a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project, as well as a resident scholar at the University of Virginia, my alma mater, Center of Politics, and Clinton Watts, former consultant to the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, and now a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an MSNBC national security analyst. What a bunch of fantastic names I've got here today. I'm going to start with you, Tara, because the genesis of this story, and I think this is really key, the genesis of this Biden pays for crack pipe story is from the Washington Free Beacon. It is a conservative, Republican-leading newspaper outlet. What is the motivation for conservatives and Republicans to promote these kinds of stories and this kind of misinformation in a news outlet?
Thanks for having me, Jason. I think you went to me first because I'm at your alma mater. But listen, it's this is part of the playbook, right? Republicans understand how to gin up their base. They know that certain buzzwords, certain cultural issues, certain issues around race, because let's be honest here, they chose the term crack pipe because I'm sure that in those circles, that is a euphemism for urban, for black, crime. You know, this is the way that people, that the fear factor that Republicans use to do this. They've done this historically. Welfare queens in the 80s, the Willie Horton ad. These are all things that they know work for their constituency, which is unfortunate, but it's politics. But what's scary here, and I know Clint will talk about this, is the fact that it seems as though the Republican Party and the right-wing ecosystem on the other side is more interested in conspiracy theory than actual fact. And these conspiracy theories are dangerous. Let's go back to Pizzagate. Remember that? The idea that there was some kind of child sex ring going on in a pizza shop in Washington, D.C., and a guy showed up with an AK-47 and shot up the pizza store. Right. I mean, these types of things lead to very dangerous acts because a lot of these people are unhinged and they act upon it because they think this is really happening. So I think it's irresponsible of them to do it, but they don't give a damn. They're doing this because it's about political expediency and getting people out to vote for them.
And clickbait, right? Because that's the whole goal. It's like, I want people screaming and raging, et cetera, et cetera. Dr. Carter, but there's real sort of dangerous consequences for this. I want to throw up this poll real quick. This is where Joe Biden stands with African-American voters. If you look at his approval rating, like April in 2021, he was at 83%. He has dropped 20% in just under a year. Why, Dr. Carter, are African-American voters inclined to even be susceptible to this kind of information? Look, black voters aren't any more susceptible to misinformation than white voters, but there's something about this kind of story that got picked up by black news outlets as well. Why does that happen?
Well, look at the historical treatment of black people by this government. I don't think that it's a hard leap for many people to make that potentially the government could actually be subsidizing people's drug addictions, and in particular crack addiction, which is racialized as black. Because of the ways that the government has treated black people. I mean, it wasn't very long ago. I mean, I'm sure many here remember when we were having congressional hearings. I mean, you saw Maxine Waters talking about what role the government actually did play in flooding black communities with cocaine throughout the 1980s. And of course, that turned into a really horrifying war on drugs that has not stopped people from using illicit substances, but it's also led to the over-policing of black communities, even though black people are not any more likely to use illicit drugs than anyone else. In fact, in most cases, less likely. And when we talk about crack cocaine in particular, this drug has been maligned in very particular ways that led to disparate sentencing for black people who were in possession, or for people, in possession of crack cocaine, who more likely were black or Latino, and we see our prisons run us over with folks from those communities. So it's not that black people are more susceptible, it's the fact that black people have historically been done wrong by the U.S. government. So it's not too far a leap to believe that the government would not just sort of subsidize, but encourage drug usage, because there is, I think, a fairly healthy belief in some sectors of black communities that the government is invested in black failure and in destroying the black community. And that can be through drugs, that can be through the dissolution of black families, that can be through a number of means. So that's why I think this story got picked up so quickly, even though it was very easily verified in other ways.
I mean, look, there's a reason that Snowfall on FX is that popular, right? There's lots of people believe that this is how this stuff happened. Clint, one of the things that we talked about a lot that I don't think is discussed enough today was misinformation in the 2020 election, and specifically how Russia engaged in misinformation. Now, look, we know right now that this is primarily from the Free Beacon. But the Russians recognized and understood, whether it's Ukraine, United States, and other places, that the best way to foment misinformation is to dig into ethnic, religious, and racial cleavages that already exist in a country. Tell us a little bit about how a story like this, the idea that the federal government was engaging in basically a free drug program to sicken and possibly kill black folks, fits into larger narratives of how we've seen foreign enemies attempt to exacerbate ethnic conflict in the United States.
Jason, going back to pre-2016, the way you infiltrate audiences, essentially in the United States, so that you can pit them against each other later, is on social issues. Race, religion, and economics are the three principal drivers for that. And they tend to go in, we saw it in 2014, 2015, trying to drive messages literally on both sides of the aisles, for and against everything, is a way to infiltrate audiences and get them fighting each other. And the outcome of that, if you look at the 2016 election, what they were trying to do, Russia, was to have the force of politics inside the United States essentially impede the U.S. using the force of, like, military intervention, in this case, like Ukraine today, to stop us from having a unified country. And what that plays forward as is a continuation of this divisive sort of politics. In 2016, they had to make fake news and throw it over the fence into the U.S. and have us take it on. Today, what they do is they take this divisive sort of lies that we see. I mean, just look at the three stories today of the news feeds of conservative media. We're talking about gazpacho police, butterflies, and crack pipes, right? When you just look at those three, they're trying to play on moral arguments, racial arguments, religious arguments. And they're not the only ones, I'd add. Iran also does this, particularly on the race and religious means. So every time they see an opportunity, if you've got Americans saying things that are good for them, they're going to amplify that and use it against other Americans.
Tara, it's one thing to have a news outlet driven by clicks lying and putting out misinformation. It's something else entirely when you have elected officials doing it. We've got Marco Rubio. We've got tweets from Marco Rubio. I'm going to bring those up, as well as Marsha Blackburn saying, oh, yes, the Biden administration is putting crack pipes out there. Not only do these collectively, they have hundreds of thousands of followers on Facebook and Twitter who are repeating this information, and then it's getting amplified. But also, these are elected officials. You can't go after them the same way that you can a newspaper. What's the danger in having elected officials who just want to out and out lie on a regular basis and don't face any consequences from their own constituents?
It gives credibility to the kookery that's going on out there. It's mainstreamed it. We see this with a number of issues. Marco Rubio, of all people, should be ashamed of himself because of how far he's fallen and what he's been willing to say and do to debase himself in order to ingratiate himself with the Trump voters that he needs. Because remember, he's running for re-election. So he's capitalizing on this wave of conservative media attention so that he can get the primary voters out to vote for him in the upcoming election this year in Florida. But he knows better. Now, Marsha Blackburn, on the other hand, she's always been on the fringes and been a mouthpiece and a loudmouth for Trumpism. This doesn't surprise me. But she's also the same person that took big pharma money in order to prevent the DEA from having more power to seize opioid seizures. So, she needs to be paying attention to what's going on in her state, where they have a historic record of opioid overdoses, instead of trying to gin up and amplify misinformation like that. But it's par for the course for these people, and it's dangerous. But only the voters can hold them accountable. And
that's the thing, Tara. I'm glad that you mentioned this point, because when it comes to racial dog whistles, crack cocaine is like, that's black people. Opioids is, that's Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad. We have to feel sorry for him. So there's this racialized element to even who we should feel bad about when it comes to drug abuse. Dr. Carter, when you're combating misinformation, I want to bring up these tweets. We've got credible sources like Roland Martin. We've got, Michael Harriot. I mean, everybody pays attention to Michael Harriot, who writes now for The Griot. It's also where I write. You have plenty of individuals who have tweeted out combating this kind of misinformation. The problem is, even for the audiences they're reaching, which are African Americans and those who may be African American outlets, they're still beat out by Marsha Blackburn. They're still beat out by the fact that the Shade Room for the Breakfast Club has way more followers than all of them combined, and they were spreading misinformation. How do we find this sort of balance where credible voices in the African American community can speak out against this information, especially because at the end of the day, if this stuff is allowed to fester, that's what leads to people not feeling like they want to vote this fall?
Well, absolutely. And that's exactly what this kind of stuff is meant to do, is to have a cooling effect on the voting booth. But I think it also means, like, the Roland Martins that you mentioned, who's often talking about this kind of stuff. It's not sexy, right? For a lot of people, the truth is much more difficult for them to accept than this really elaborate lie. Who is staking their political career on crack pipes? I mean, that just boggles the mind, given the way that crack has been maligned, given the racial nature of that, the racialized nature of the way we talk about that drug, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that you have people who should be smarter, should be savvier, and using their platforms more responsibly, amplifying these stories, we have to go for them too and say, you have to do better, because it's not enough for just the Rolands of the world and the Michael Harriets and others of the world to sort of be out here saying these things, because as you say, they're yelling into the void. Their followers are not the same followers probably that are looking at the Breakfast Club and the Shade Room. And if these people want to consider themselves players on the national stage, and in particular as influencers of brown votes. I mean, everybody goes to the Breakfast Club now if they want to talk politics. We've seen people show up on the Shade Room and in other spaces, right? Because we know they have large Black young audiences, all people we want to attract to voting booths. Then you have to also have the same sort of level of scrutiny of them and not just let them get by with being entertainers, right? Because they have a lot of responsibility now. If you want to play in that space, then you have to do it in a responsible manner. And we have to demand more of them and not just ask sort of the same sort of venerable folks that we know in Black media to do all the heavy lifting, because they're going to be crowded out of the conversation anyway.
Right. There's not one person in the Biden administration who's like, hey, here's my career. Let me sprinkle some crack on it and think that that's going to work.
Exactly.
I want to close with this, because this is really important, Clint. We also have this other misinformation story about literally a butterfly research facility that had to get shut down in Texas because of right-wing information. Now, look, if it was Peacemaker and he was fighting butterflies, that's one thing. But this is literally just a research facility for environmental purposes that had to shut down because of the violence associated with misinformation that they believed that they were, hiding pedophiles or something else like that. What are the government consequences to misinformation? Tara mentioned people showing up with guns, but we've just got a health. This is an environmental facility that's been shut down. What's the long-term danger of this sort of thing?
It's called mediated terrorism, Jason. And what that means is the idea of making these claims, if you have an outsized audience, if you have a large audience, even if you're basically saying it in jest sometimes, or if you're being somewhat serious about it for political gain, when these speakers in the political sphere make these claims, 1 out of 100 people believe them. And they don't just believe them, they're angry to the point where they either mobilize to a place like January 6th, or they go in terms of an assault on a place like this butterfly sanctuary under false pretense. Tara's exactly right. This is an absolute replay at the Butterfly Sanctuary of what we saw with Pizzagate just 5 to 6 years ago. And the idea is when they throw these ideas out there over the fence, you might remember Anwar al-Awlaki, which was mentioned in some of the bulletins, throw out a plot, throw out a concept that involves violence, and someone might undertake it. And then the person that comes up with the plot can wave their hands and say, oh, I didn't tell anyone to do that. It was just an idea. So it's a way to have plausible deniability but still achieve the effect. I think the danger is there's a lot of innocent people around this country, election workers, healthcare, frontline workers in our fight against COVID. Butterfly Sanctuary, these are places for children's education that are facing direct threats to their life and safety. These are creating real world harms. And I think that's where, as a country, we got to figure out what do we want to police and how do we want to police it. And I think saving the lives of people that are public servants, saving the lives of healthcare workers, that seems like something we need to focus on in a big way. And these individuals, they believe this stuff. It's not going to go away. And that's why the politicians who are making these false claims ultimately should be held accountable for what they're saying and the ultimate what happens from all of this.
Dr. Niambi Carter, Tara Setmeyer, and Clint Watts, thank you guys so much for starting us off this hour.